Hello everyone, welcome to another one of our Odinism videos. Today we're going to be comparing the Eddas to the Gospel of Luke. Now in my previous video comparing the Bible as a whole to the Eddas, there was a lot of information given, and this can be overwhelming for someone who's simply just asking the question which is more reliable. Now to level the playing field a little bit, for the sake of the Eddas, we're not going to test the whole Bible in this video as far as whether or not this is reliable. I'm only going to choose one specific book out of the 66 available to me and compare the evidence supporting that to the entire Eddas. And also note as well that if I can make this comparison fairly, we will seek to prove two things. One, if the Bible, not just the Bible, but one book of the Bible, has more historical evidence to support it than the entire written record of Odinism, it's that much more worth believing in. And then two, of course, that evidence can actually give us good reasons to test and trust our spiritual beliefs. Now, just to clarify, in the previous video I took for granted the fact that we understood what evidence was and why it matters when referring to the spiritual realm. Why test physical things in order to determine whether non-physical things exist? It's a fair point. But we need to realize that Odinists and Christians both have something vitally in common when it comes to their beliefs. We both recognize and believe that the divine has interacted with this world in a moment of history. The spiritual has entered into the physical. So much like wind itself can't be examined, but the impact that it makes on physical things can be measured in the same way. Those even who would take a more spiritualized approach towards Odinism, being of the Asatru crowd, and say that, well, we aren't sure where Asgard is, if it's even physical necessarily, or if the only realm that we interact with in this world is one of them and the other 9, or the 9 is total, are spiritualized in this sake. Even if you take that interpretation, we need to understand this. Every single Odinist knows that their religion actually claims things about their gods that will admit their fingerprints have been left on this world at one time or another. And note, the world we currently live in, not some distant, far destroyed and rebuilt world in the past. So understand this. We can't test spiritual to spiritual. We're not spiritual beings. But we can test where and when the spiritual has or has not interacted with the physical. For Christians, we believe that the one true God became a man in a moment of history and demonstrated this through audible words and observable deeds. We test that through history. For Odinists, they need to be aware that the less evidence that they have in their favor, the more they should reconsider their beliefs. Likewise for Christians. So, which this ultimately brings us to the evidence. What exactly do we mean by evidence, and what are we looking for when we say, look at the evidence? Well, 3 terms to define. One is evidence, which simply means, and this is what is meant when I use that word in this study, what makes something that makes something else more likely to be true. So if I use the word evidence, it is something that would make something else more likely to be true. Note, I don't mean 100% certain, but certainly puts the progress bar on the loading screen a little bit further than it was before. Likewise, what do I mean by history? This was clarified in the previous video, but we will repeat it for the sake of clarity. What was observed in the past by eyewitnesses that can be trusted beyond a reasonable doubt. So if I have eyewitnesses and I have at least some reason to trust them, then I would consider it history. The more the better. And then finally, criticism, which means testing strengths as well as weaknesses. So in our time here today, we are going to use historical criticism to find evidence. Or in other words, we're going to look for things that will make Christianity and Odinism more likely to be true, based on what we can test about each religion says about what people saw happen in the past. So with that said, historical criticism is going to come in one of 3 forms. Multiple attestation is the first and most impactful, I guess would be the proper word to say. What other sources can we look to around the same time that say the same basic thing? The second will be accounts of embarrassment. What details are we given that wouldn't have been made up or embellished? And then finally, contemporary work. How close to the original eyewitnesses or the events themselves can our earliest piece of evidence get us? So, with all that said and hopefully clarified, if you want further information or want to know why and how I'm going to be using these things so that the video itself flows more smoothly, leave them in the comments below. I will do everything in my power to make sure that remains open. YouTube may not make that so simple, but we will see. So, starting with the Eddas. For those of you who saw our comparison of the Eddas to the Bible, you have heard all this information before, but I will repeat it for the sake of clarity and being fair. First and foremost, in regards to the test of multiple attestation, whether or not other sources during the same time say basically the same thing about the events in the Eddas. Unfortunately, for the case of Odinism, the claims it makes about history remain entirely on its own authority, meaning that it doesn't necessarily mean it's false, it just means the only one who said this happened is the Eddas itself. So, historical scholars in this case would put it in the realm of mythology. It essentially means these details can't be tested through this method. I'm not saying that they're false, I am saying that we can't test them through multiple attestation. We're going to have to look elsewhere if we're going to call this history. Second standard for accounts of embarrassment. Now, fortunately for Odinism's case, there are very embarrassing details given to us about the gods of Odinism through the Eddas. And if analyzed historically, this method of criticism would conclude these were details that had to be admitted rather than embellished. For example, in the Lay of Thrym, or Thrymskvitha, in verses 10 through 20, Loki reports to Thor that his hammer has been stolen, and the only way to get it back is to have the goddess Freya marry the giants. Freya, of course, not wanting to capitulate for Thor's negligence, instead has him dress up as a woman, and as well as Loki, and being a bridesmaid, he didn't seem to have a problem with it, nonetheless, in order to retrieve his hammer dressed as a woman. Now, according to verse 16 of the Lay of Thrym, he was not happy about having to dress like this, lest he be called effeminate, unmanly, or in the literal translation from the ancient Norse, a homosexual. So this would be an embarrassing detail that would have to have been admitted by Thor, and Odinists could use this and say, see, why would they say the sort of things about Thor if it embarrassed them by our own cultural standards? Second, in the wranglings of Loki, also known as Lokasena, in verses 20, 26, 30, 32, 52, and 54, Freya, Frigg, Sif, Skathi, Ithun, and Loki himself expose serial infidelity among their parts, as well as fratricide, Loki taking credit for the death of Balder. Now, this was limited to, nor included but not limited to, Loki's own history of becoming female and birthing a child in order to prevent a giant from completing a task required of him by the Aesir, who promised Freya as a reward, once again. And this is according to the commentary of Dr. Henry Adams Bellows, one of the earliest and most prominent English translators of the Eddas. And finally, in the poem of Harbath, also known as Harbasloth, in verses 30 through 34, it mentions Thor and Odin having a conversation about his sexual adventures. And Odin mentions in verse 32 that he needed Thor's help in holding the white maid fast, to which Thor replied in the positive, had he been there. Now, while certain points of culture like rape in the poem of Harbath were overlooked for the sake of Norse culture, infidelity and cross-dressing, at least on the woman's part, were humiliating in Norse culture, and wouldn't have been spoken of the greatest of the Aesir, like Thor, unless they had to admit these details. And in the realm of historical criticism, these events would increase the likelihood of these events being true, since they harm the reputation of individuals you would expect embellishment from. And finally, contemporary work. How close to the original events do the Eddas bring us? Well, according to the Eddas itself, as well as the scholarly notes of translators, the earliest evidence of the Eddas in writing, note that, in writing, was the Codex Regius, or R2365, and it was discovered by a Christian bishop named Brynjolfur Svensson, and he, in 1643, tested the manuscripts according to what his own material in testing manuscripts was able to accomplish. Now, whatever method he used, he dated these at least back to the 1300s and attributed them later on to a man named Snorri Sturluson by Angrimir Johnson. Now, most scholars don't reject this conclusion and claim, despite the times that they were in, they say that this was an accurate summation. These quotations that were recognized as Norse poems, this is in the prose Eddas, Gylfaginning for the most part, but it includes others. Within this time frame, put this man who would have lived passing through Iceland, where the manuscript was likely made. And on top of this, there are other claims that these works go back even farther in writing to the works of Saemund the Wise in the 11th century. Now, whether this is true or not remains an open question, since all of the written material from him has been lost. We can't confirm or deny whether or not he actually wrote these things because we don't have any of his writings. But going with what we have, the earliest written example of Odinism's core claims date to about 1,000 years after Gothic and Germanic cultures began interacting with Christians and converting to Christianity in the 4th century. The only earlier mention of anything close to Odinism is recorded for us in Fox's Book of Martyrs, where a missionary encountered a shrine to the Norse god Thor. His tree was sacred, and the local shamans threatened the missionary that if they even touched it, they would be struck with lightning. So, taking up an axe, the Christian missionary cut down the tree and showed Thor, as they understood him then, to be a false god, and the tribe converted to Christianity. Now, details about this have likely been embellished. I'll even admit that as a Christian. Say, for example, one record reports that after one swing of the axe, a mighty wind toppled the tree in its entirety as a sign from God to the Nords. But nonetheless, the adherents to the cult of Arianism, not Christians, do confirm that this time was within the time frame that the Goths, Nords for the most part, started becoming Christian. This is the earliest documented mention of Thor in antiquity, and it dates to 700 years before Saemund the Wise. Therefore, we have at least this much reason to trust the Eddas is based on oral tradition that went before its time. But in conclusion, scholars conclude that the Eddas is mythological because the vast majority of their historical claims can't be tested or verified by any standard apart from itself. However, due to the culturally embarrassing details about the Azir's poor moral character and having to admit to things that their own culture frowned upon, a genuine Odinist could claim these embarrassing details prove it wasn't fictional, because of the examples of their moral paragons falling short of their own standards. Without these things, however, Odinism doesn't have anything else to stand on. So with all that said, now let's move on to the Gospel of Luke. And remember, we're not testing the whole Bible this time. We're picking one of the 66 books contained in the Bible and testing its historical validity based on the same standards we applied to the entirety of the Eddas, with 3 separate poems and references to their own scholars in order to make this claim. So, starting with multiple attestation, what does Luke have going for it as far as this standard of criticism, that we have other sources that report or back up the same thing that is reported by the Gospel of Luke? Well, according to the historian Sir William Ramsay, Luke was to be considered by modern standards, a historian of the first rank. He was so impacted by his intention to detail in reporting the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth that he converted to Christianity after trying to debunk it. And understand, he wasn't a Christian when he started trying to examine Luke historically, but because of the sort of data that supported Jesus' resurrection, reliably recorded history was his only conclusion. So then, with those core claims supported both in and outside of Christianity, I'd like to go through 7 in the realm of multiple attestation. Now remember, we don't have one for the Eddas. First, in Tacitus, the writings of the Roman historian Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, reports that Jesus, he refers to him as Christus, was executed as a criminal during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Now, in Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, we are given that time frame for the ministry of Jesus as well. We'll get into more of that in a moment. Second, the Babylonian Talmud, the writings of Talmud Sanhedrin, verse 67, reports Jesus was executed by the Romans. And remember that the Talmud and the writings of the Sanhedrin were not fans of Jesus. The same sources also report that he was demon-possessed, so note that. As well, a Jewish Roman historian named Josephus reported Jesus was executed during the governorship of Pontius Pilate, further backed up in Luke chapter 3 and verses 1 through 2 in his book Annals, book 15, chapter 40, or excuse me, I skipped my place there, in Antiquities, chapter 18 and section 3. Likewise, there are lots of references within Luke's biography of Jesus' life that details how we know for certain elsewhere. For example, Caesar Augustus is mentioned during the time of Jesus' birth. And this is important because we can know for certain when he existed. And Luke does us the favor of even narrowing down the time frame that Quirinius was also reigning over Syria, what we would know as those modern borders. Now, according to Josephus, referencing the previous account, Quirinius had 2 reigns over that region of the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. And it is from that time we date by modern calendars that Jesus' birth would have been around 6 to 4 BC. Now, we also have records in Egypt of cyclical censuses for the purpose of taxes that, and I quote, ordered each man to his own hearth. Now, skeptics like to play a song and dance about whether or not this meant they had to go to their family's home or just their own home back in Nazareth. But Luke didn't spare us the fact that it was a very unique circumstance for Mary and Joseph to be traveling there. Dismissing it would have to be a conclusion made in spite of the evidence, not because of it. So note that. We do have reason to believe that according to Luke 2, verses 1 through 3, that the reign of Caesar Augustus, the reign of Quirinius, which is also corroborated by Josephus, and the fact that a census was being called for the sake of taxes, that they would have to travel to their own hearth. And whatever circumstances put Mary and Joseph in that sort of situation where they had to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the record still stands. You can deny the historical record, but that's not smart to do with evidence, especially if you're trying to debunk it. Fifth, Caesar Tiberius is mentioned as having reigned for 15 years when John the Baptist began preaching of the Messiah's arrival. He further confirms this by specifying it was during that time that Pontius Pilate was governing Judea. He also uses the appropriate Roman title of Tetrarch for Herod's position in Galilee, as well as specifies what other 2 tetrarchs were ruling over that area, and clarifies them as separate from Herod during this time. He also specifies which Herod, since there were a lot of people with that name in politics. He also specifies as well that there were 2 high priests reigning at this time, the first of which, Caiaphas, we have uncovered archaeologically. We have his family tomb, as well as not only bearing his own name, but available for viewing in Jerusalem today. We uncovered a slab that was dedicated to Pontius Pilate, with Tiberius's name underneath him, showing that they both existed at the same time. And further Jewish writings verify Luke's report of this state of Jewish politics. There was 2 high priests, one recognized by the Romans and one recognized by the fellow Jews, Caiaphas and Annas, during this time period. So that would be something supported in Luke 3, 1 through 3. Sixth, Luke has a 100% accuracy rate in reporting the cities surrounding the Galilee region, as well as those on Jesus' way to Jerusalem before we were aware they existed, which included but were not limited to Capernaum, Bethesda, the Lake of Gennesaret, the Gadarenes, Bethany, Bethphage, Bethlehem, the Olivet Mountain, Jericho, and of course Jerusalem itself. Now they are all properly detailed where relevant as the kind of location that would have been during the time of Augustus and Tiberius. Now, why is that important? Because if a skeptic was seeking to examine this kind of evidence, they could say, now wait a minute, you say that Jesus visited, say for example, Bethany, but modern archaeology discovers that either Bethany A isn't a place, Jesus visited a non-existent town, or B, Bethany was destroyed before Jesus' time. Why would Jesus visit a city that had been destroyed when he talks about it being inhabited by people, let alone having a functional synagogue there? Well, here's the point. If we look at these kinds of details and find out that, yes, indeed, Bethany was destroyed and Jerusalem was taken over by foreign powers after the time of Christ, then it does make sense Christ could visit them before they were destroyed. So there weren't any anachronisms, historically false errors, in reporting Jesus visited a city that hadn't existed at this time. And these sources are also confirmed by Roman and Jewish records, what were mentioned prior, as these areas being in existence at this time. Us digging them up and finding them only proves the point further. Bethany, Jericho, Bethesda, Capernaum, and the Olivet Mountains have all been examined, indeed to have been inhabited areas Jesus could have visited at this time. And then finally, number 7, the heel bone of Johanan. A Jewish criminal, at least by Roman standards, was given the right of a proper burial and had his bones stored in a bone box, an ossuary, appropriate for Jewish customs at the time, with a nail still lodged into his foot. This proves 2 core claims about Luke's report about Jesus' death. First, it was possible that Jesus could have been taken down and given a proper burial, despite facing a brutal Roman execution as a criminal. Until this time, say for example at the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan and others proposed Jesus was thrown into, they explained the empty tomb by saying that Jesus wasn't even buried in a tomb, that when Rome executed criminals, they were just thrown to the dogs or let them wild animals tear them apart. Unfortunately, Johannan's discovery showed that not only could a crucified victim, charged as a criminal of course, could have been properly buried, it backs up the claim that Luke made about Jesus in order to give it more historical credibility. And then finally, we also see that since Johannan's heel bone dated to the 1st century, that Jews were in fact still being crucified at this time. You can't crucify someone if crucifixion's not being practiced. It would like being said that in the United States they were executing people through beheading in the 21st century. That's simply not the case. But if, on the other hand, we do find out of documented examples of beheading victims in the United States and public events declaring beheading of so-and-so for charges of murder and kidnapping, well, then that would back up the account. Well, we see crucifixion being employed during and towards a victim during the same time that Jesus would have lived. And you can see that heel bone on display with the nail still in it, retrieved from a bone box, proper Jewish burial, during this time. Proves 2 key points. Now there are others, but for the sake of time, we're about 23 minutes in, so I'm going to continue on to our second account, the account of embarrassment. Now, while the Eddas certainly has this going for it, the Gospel of Luke has this as well. First, in the 1st chapter of Luke, verses 18 through 20, the priest Zacharias, who would be father to John the Baptist, doesn't believe God will answer his prayers for a son when an angel is literally telling him that they have been heard and answered. Now understand why this is embarrassing, because in Jewish culture, where do they believe that their entire race started from? Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah conceived basically the second line in the long history of Jewish descendants through Isaac. And Isaac was conceived when she was 98 years old, or 99 years old. So think about that for a second. He doesn't believe that an old woman could conceive a child, let alone give birth, but his entire culture is based on that assuming to have happened. It's an embarrassing detail, especially for a priest, to doubt that kind of claim, especially from an angel. Second, Jesus' hometown of Nazareth rejected his claims to be the Messiah. They even tried to kill him in Luke 4:28 through 30. Jesus openly associated and ate with people Jesus considered, or that Jewish culture rather, considered sellouts to Rome, as well as sinners in general, referring to tax collectors. Now, this was embarrassing because to eat with somebody in Jewish culture was to be considered becoming one with them. If people didn't believe that Jesus was God, then people would assume Jesus was becoming a sinner through association. That's embarrassing. Fourth, Jesus was approached by a prostitute and washed his feet with her hair in tears. Now, there certainly wasn't anything sexual going on here, but detractors could treat this as a sexual advance on the woman's part. This would be an embarrassing detail to include. And this is recorded in Luke 7:36 through 39. Fifth, Jesus' apostles admitted their failure to understand what Jesus taught them, despite being told over and over again this is how it would work. Now, if you're the one writing the story, wouldn't you want to leave those things out if you're making it up? This is why it fits into the account of embarrassment. They include details that make themselves look bad. The most direct example is in Luke 9:45. Sixth, Jesus allowed women to hold positions of honor among his disciples and students. This is in Luke 10:39. Now we'll repeat and clarify this further in another second, but understand why that was embarrassing in first century, not 21st century American, first century Jewish culture. Every single morning, Jews started their prayers by saying, Lord of heaven, I thank you that I was not born a slave, a Gentile, or a woman. Rabbis didn't like taking on women as among their disciples, let alone positions of honor where they would be able to sit at their feet, the prize pupil status, if you will. So catch that. Also, 7, Jesus is accused of being demon-possessed, not just according to Jesus' enemies, but according to the own Gospels. This is in Luke 11:14 through 15. His enemies call him possessed by the devil. In number 8, Jesus heals 10 lepers, but the only one that thanked him for it would have been considered a cultural exile in the Jewish community, a Samaritan. Now, if you're talking about something you would make up towards a Jewish community, about a Jewish Messiah, would you want to include the sort of people that they were racist towards as the ones that actually got their acts together and thanked Jesus for the healing, and the other 9 Jewish individuals didn't? This would be embarrassing for them. 9th, one of Jesus' disciples, this is Luke 17:11 through 18, by the way, for the account of the 10 lepers. In Luke 22:49 through 51, one of Jesus' disciples tries to defend him from the arrest he already explained was going to happen no matter what. Jesus also rebukes the disciple, even though his name isn't mentioned. This was for legal reasons, obviously. Also note, and finally, number 10, the original and first eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection were all women, according to Luke 24 and verse 1. This would be embarrassing for a Jewish culture because the credibility of a woman was not admissible in court. Now, these aren't the kind of details you embellish. The first century Jewish culture and context is what Luke was written in. And these would be the sort of things, and there are more, but these would be the sort of things you would have to admit rather than make up and hurt your own credibility. Then finally, contemporary work. How close was Luke to the events themselves? While the Eddas is about 1,000 years separated from the events at best, assuming Thor just finished interacting with the Germanic and Saxon tribes in the 3rd century BC, Luke is largely borrowing from Matthew's Gospel. He states as such in the 1st chapter, in a desire to set in order the sort of things that the eyewitnesses have reported among us. This is referring to Peter, Matthew, John, and the other disciples. Now, he is confirmed to have lived during the lifetimes of the original apostles by having his gospel quoted by Paul in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 5, verses 17 through 18. Since Paul died in 67 AD, when he was executed by the Emperor Nero, even non-Christian scholars won't call Paul's credibility into question. Luke and his writings would have to then date within 30 years of the events that they report at the latest. Why? Because if Luke was quoted by Paul, Luke's writings couldn't be quoted by Paul unless they existed. And Paul generally can't write something if he's already beheaded. If these events took place in either 30 or 33 AD, then you have to narrow it down and say, okay, then what I can conclude is if they're quoted by Paul, they existed at the time of Paul. And if they were quoted by Paul and he's not dead yet, then we have that time frame. If he was executed by Nero, when did Nero die? He can't execute somebody if Nero is dead. And the point goes on. So compared to the Eddas, compared to the Gospel, we have Luke within 30 years of the historical events he reports. The Eddas, we don't know. So, in conclusion, One book of my Bible has more historical credibility than the entire Eddas. I think that speaks for itself. If you're looking for a religion based on history, I can't recommend Odinism, but if you would like a religion that's based on testable and verifiable facts, I would encourage you to look more into Jesus Christ. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you more about this in the future.